tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North. Obviously, we've been speaking for weeks, for years now, about the COVID restrictions that have, in many ways, as I've said time and time again, been in some key areas far worse than the virus against which these restrictions were intended to protect, especially as the virus has gotten weaker through the Omicron phase when some governments were insisting on adding restrictions. Now, slowly but surely, we've seen some of these start to be lifted. Notably, Alberta and Saskatchewan took a very swift approach to getting rid of their vaccine passports. In Ontario and Quebec and other provinces, we have a bit of a slower uptake. But the big question here is, when is the pandemic over and who gets to decide? It's the World Health Organization that said we were in the midst of a pandemic, but do we have to wait for their cue to say it's over? Well, a few weeks back, you may recall we spoke to Irvin Studin of the Institute for 21st Century Questions, which had assembled a crack committee called the Canada Science and Policy Committee to exit the pandemic. The focus was to figure out in concrete ways how to get Canada from the indefinite, never-ending lockdown, permanent emergency to a place of where we want to be, which is hopefully getting rid of all of these restrictions. Irvin Studin joins me back on the show now. The committee has, after just a few weeks, said that the pandemic is effectively over. And let's start there, Irvin, because words matter, and you're not saying over, you're saying effectively over. What does that mean, and how does it differ from over?
Well, thanks, first of all, for having me, and thanks for all your reporting, and thanks for allowing these types of interviews with proper answers about serious topics. Andrew, the pandemic is effectively over for Canada. We've declared it such on the Canada Science Policy Committee to exit the pandemic. It's a similar declaration for countries like Singapore, Israel, Ireland, United Kingdom, Spain, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, Finland. I could go on. They're no less smart than we are. In fact, they've collapsed their systems less. They've determined that it is now effectively endemic, which means that it has a highly seasonal character, first of all. Secondly, that their systems are able to deal with any rises and falls, of course, during seasonal variation, as are ours. And thirdly, on a systems understanding in Canada, it is the minor problem amongst 8 crises of system that are very serious in the countries. All those things combined mean that it's steady, as it's full on as she goes through the systems. We exit with high energy. The pandemic is over for us. We are not following the science as a science project, because then you would say, well, a virus never ends. We could be following the science and studying COVID-19 for a century. And that's what happens with all historical viruses. It is a policy lead. The science informs that. And we're at a point, both through vaccination, other immunity, other interventions, and the passage of the virus, the mutations, at a point where we're ready to exit quite easily across the systems that we'll discuss. So that's the considered determination across huge study and consultation by the committee over a short period of time. And we're ready to go. So we presented our exit plan on the back of an endemicity declaration that we say with considerable certainty and consistent with other positions and our own domestic circumstances.
You mentioned a few moments ago, Irvin, a whole list of countries that have done what we've been hoping for in Canada for quite some time. They've lifted restrictions. They've declared the pandemic effectively over. And in those cases, though, it was governments that made that declaration, governments that made the determination to lift these restrictions. Why in Canada, and I mean no disrespect to you and your group here, but why in Canada is it falling to a private sector group to make this declaration instead of governments making it?
We're not for profit, but we are doing it in some sense for the government, which is unable to make that declaration for a host of reasons, both backing themselves into ideological corners, into corners of fetish, into slogans, corners online. They're just unable to say what is obvious to a policy community that is observing this both nationally and internationally. I should say, it is a policy lead. So when you say government, it is not scientists that declare the pandemic is over. The scientists study and they advise, but government and policy people decide. This is what we've got wrong from the ab initio at the very start in Canada. We started working in slogans, follow the science or the virus is in charge. Nay, policy is in charge. We study the virus. We have science advisors amongst many other advisors across the disciplines, and they advise policy people who make a determination. The policy determination is that we're good to go across the systems. The science determination is that it is endemic. It feeds into a policy conclusion, and we provide the choreography of exit across the systems. The other countries that you've mentioned did not collapse their systems to the same degree that we have, and I'm sure we'll discuss that, which is why, contrary to what we say online or what the government imagines when it says, I got to have a gut feeling that we should exit slowly, steady as she goes, see what the numbers are. It has to be full on, full energy, not just restrictions. Obviously, the restrictions go immediately, and then we'll discuss that. But across the other systems that have collapsed, national unity, public health, non-COVID, education, the economy, the international picture, the social fabric, we've collapsed those to a very, very considerable degree. And so we can't just afford to look at COVID cases, ICU counts. All of that is for the good, but it has to be in a complex of systems thinking, and the conclusion is we're off. We got to go, go, go. Otherwise, the systems continue to collapse, COVID notwithstanding.
Let me then ask you about why that's happening in your estimation and your fellow committee members here. Is it because government is relying on bad science or flawed science, or is it that governments are, in your view, drawing the wrong conclusions from science that is at its core sound?
It's a great question, and it's one for the history books, and we do at the end of our this exit table that we provided. I recommend all people looking at is 8x21 matrix with detailed choreography across all regions of the country, across all systems. At the end, we do call for a royal commission on the pandemic, lessons learned and best practices around the world. My own working hypothesis is that we collapsed intellectually and systems-wise in the machinery of government at the very start, whereas science advisors and scientists were at the very margins of public decision-making. In 2019, we all of a sudden said, the scientists are in charge. And our scientists are some of the best in the world. They're clinically excellent and they're well-intentioned, good professionals. But with the greatest respect, they stink at public policy. Public policy is a separate craft, no less complex, and requiring no less intellectual capacity.
Well, yeah, they're not economists. They're not constitutional scholars. And I mean, those are just two significant things that were absent from much of the discourse early on, especially, but I'd say even now to some extent.
Education specialists, social scientists, social policy people, economists, business people, constitutional lawyers, international strategists, national unity thinkers, everything related to the complex system that we call Canadian society, second largest country in the world. And we imagine that all of our thinking reduces to COVID. The COVID is the central condition. And COVID is obviously a massive shock to the system. But all along, we should have had a complex of thinkers and a synthesis at the top called a policy synthesis. That's what leadership is about. We collapsed that in favor of the scientists who all of a sudden had decision-making power and veto power over school closures, business closures, border closures, the social fabric, vaccination, non-vaccination. They signed off on government and decision-making in all these spheres that extended well beyond their legitimate ken. In many cases, they didn't know what they were doing, but they were charged with this, and perhaps they grew to be confident about it, and it's clear that they overstretched. What we've done on this committee, I think it's very original across the countries, and I'm not aware of any other committee, national committee in any other country around the world that has done this. We brought a communion between the scientists and the doctors and the policy community across many disciplines. We brought them together to exit nationally, and we have a policy lead. The science feeds into that. And so the choreography we have is that of a policy choreography determined by excellent science and scientists.
One thing that was interesting looking at the table that you provided here is you don't just break it down chronologically, from steps you take in February and March and beyond, but also regionally. And some things are general, the end of restrictions. That's something that applies in the North, Atlantic Canada, Central Canada, the West. Where are the areas where you do think there are regional differences here that need to be taken into consideration? Because that's not something that we've really heard discussed. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's been a very one-size-fits-all solution that has been offered by the federal government, certainly.
It's a great question. The country is very big, I repeat. It's the second biggest country in the world, and we divide it into 4 regions. Atlantic center is Canada, Ontario, Quebec. The West, 4 provinces, and the huge North, which is the size territorially of the European Union. So it's huge. For Ontario, for instance, the most cataclysmic school closures, we recommend an immediate door-to-door campaign to find the 100,000 plus third bucket kids out of all school permanently, not homeschooled, not pod school, not physical school, no school. We must be found immediately. That's particular to Ontario. And then something like Section 22 that has allowed Office of Medical Health to close schools and close businesses in a very decentralized way. We advised for that to be rescinded in the Ontario Health Protection Promotion Act immediately, on top of all other restrictions, vaccine passports. But if you go to the north of the country, all of a sudden we talk about international borders, we talk about borders between the territories, very different realities because they are completely isolated. If you go to the west of the country, we have specific recommendations related to Indigenous communities, to business and grants and loan guarantees. We also announced a national Canada Walk for Youth on April 3rd of this year to really physically impose the youth who have suffered most during this pandemic of Canada to get out in sports teams, schools, communities, university level, to show their force. They are the future. So the choreography, you're right, is very regional, properly so, because the pandemic has been very variegated across the regions through time, across 8 systems. Let me go through the systems quickly. There's COVID public health, non-COVID public health. There's education, the economy, institutions, national unity, social fabric, international. One quick thing that people won't recognize, including decision makers, is while we call for immediate removal of vaccination mandates, vaccination conditionality, although continued new vaccination campaigns for the most immunosuppressed, immunocompromised, and aged when new vaccines come out. For everyone else, it's off to the races. We're learning, we're studying immediately, without fetish, without any zombie exit, without anything gradual, immediate, because we need that high energy. But people don't realize that there are all these vaccination impositions across the society that are out of control. Businesses, schools, private schools, camps, universities, sports clubs that are just being imposed and proliferated out of control, mostly for marketing or fetish purposes or ideological purposes. And when the government stops the vaccination mandates at the center, these continue and they create huge chaos in the social fabric. So all these systems need to be understood in their totality. And we call for an end to that. Again, not for ideological purposes, but because that's over, we're off to the races across the systems.
Oh, I mean, obviously, a lot of the restrictions to do with travel, to do with public servants, to do with some of the national level things like vaccine procurement are areas that are within the purview of the federal government. A lot of the things that you're pushing for when it comes to healthcare systems, when it comes to education, are things that would have to be instituted at a provincial level. And we know that premiers talk, the first ministers and the prime minister, they all get together. But when push comes to shove, how do you choreograph something when you're talking about 13 different governments, not to mention local and regional governments underneath that?
It's a great question. On the federal side, just strict federal powers, obviously we advise and call for a reinstitution of federal control over interprovincial borders, and those need to be removed. Physical borders, regulatory borders, psychological borders. Let us never imagine in the future that provinces will just willy-nilly set up interprovincial borders. That's proper.
And you're just talking about within the country there.
That's within the country.
Yes.
These are interprovincial and provincial territorial borders that have been erected willy-nilly by provinces. And the federal government ceded that authority. The federal government was reimpose itself and rid the country of these internal borders, because otherwise we don't have a country, we don't have a federation. Huge blockages to economic wealth and travel and psychological unity. But the federal government must bang heads. The leaders are the provincial governments that have imposed restrictions for a variety of interests and purposes. The federal government must choreograph this exit by bringing everyone together and launching this national plan. A lot of the instruments are in the provincial hands, some municipal, but the federal government must declare for the country, as we've already allowed it to do through this national committee, nonpartisan, that it's over. It's over because other countries have already said such. Our capacity to deal with any seasonal uptick is plentiful. And on a systems understanding, Canada has other fish to fry, very serious ones. So the federal government has huge instruments, has huge spending power still. It has interprovincial, it has international power, and it controls huge institutions, sectors like the banks, all the interprovincial international transport sectors. The North, which in my other thinking is the future of the country, will open up huge arteries of imagination and economic and social activity. And that all of that is in Ottawa.
One dimension of this roadmap that I found quite fascinating, because it's not something that's gotten, I'd say, any substantive discussion, is the rebuilding of institutional trust in Canada. I think certainly mistrust has been something we hear spoken about on an individual level, and certainly in media. It's a discussion that I've had here on this show and elsewhere, people not trusting public health officials, politicians, and in many cases for good reason. But you've actually put this specifically front and center in the roadmap: recovery of trust in institutions and also institutional efficacy. So it goes hand in hand. I think the institutions need to be effective, and they also need to communicate that efficacy. First off, do you agree with my assertion that this has not gotten nearly enough attention? And I guess more fundamentally, how do you rebuild that trust?
Correct. It's not got enough attention because some of the ones that need to provide the attention are the ones in whom trust has been lost, frankly. So we start with the information space. I don't want to call it the media space. I call it the information space. How Canadians get their information, how they feed information to government, how government feeds information to Canadians. Over the last 2 years, we've been unable to tell our own stories, our own realities. It's also important that it also explains why we do regional roadmaps on top of the national one, because the regions are so different amongst themselves, and we're not able to tell that diversity of experience to the central governments, to media apparatus based in Toronto and Montreal, who are not leaving Zoom rooms. So media is one of them. Huge deficiency in performance over the last 2 years. We can explain why, but that needs to be reconsolidated if we're going to have a country that is able to inform its decision makers about realities on the ground and tell its own stories to itself. Governments at all levels have essentially been operating in emergency mode for 2 years. Leave aside the Emergencies Act in Ottawa. This emergencies power is almost universal. It's by 2 or 3 people at the center of government in all the provincial capitals and the federal capital, making decrees by fiat for countries for a country they do not see, that is, again, the second largest in the world, with those feedback mechanisms absent because the media itself is not reporting properly. The media itself is not leaving the Zoom room. And as a result, regardless of the intellect and good intention of the decision makers, huge mistakes of public policy and administration. Hence the 8 crises of system we have in the country that are not seen in other countries less developed or smaller. They just did not collapse because they didn't collapse the institutions. And of course, there are other institutions, like if you want to call the emergency or police services, you have to wonder whether they'll come in some cases. If you want to do banking, if there's a mistake in the banking, if your account is frozen in the current circumstances, what are the appeal mechanisms? If your child, son or daughter, is not being educated because of closures in schools and the third bucket condition we talked about, what is the appeal mechanism? How do you get information about how to re-educate your child? This is all collapse of systems and institutions that were foreign to us in 2019. And we have to carefully reconsolidate, reconstitute these institutions if we're going to have a country.
So, as we talked about earlier, this is something that you are driving with your committee to advise the government. Governments do not like moving swiftly, as we've seen, even with places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, which have been more quick than other jurisdictions to want to lift their vaccine passports and whatnot. They are putting plans in place that take weeks to months to do it. So how do you, with your data, with your information, go to governments and say, no, you can do this immediately?
Right. So Great question. Again, good questions as always, Andrew. I want to, for your distinguished listeners, just disabuse them of the idea that the exit is just removal of restrictions.
Well, that is the first step. That's where that's coming from.
No, it's a concurrent step. And why? Because we say that it's the very first box amongst hundreds of them. Removal of all restrictions. with the proviso for the immunocompromised, immunosuppressed. Why? Not because I like or dislike restrictions, because on the system's understanding, we've collapsed all the other ones, and therefore we need to move with speed. But if we were only to remove restrictions, we would still have 200,000 kids out of school, still huge learning gaps. We still have tens of thousands of businesses disintegrated, huge social conflict. So we need to restitch all of that as we remove restrictions. It's not remove restrictions and off she goes, because that is continued chaos. So government needs to move on all systems beyond just removal of restrictions, which is the negative step. Governments are historically slow. Canada is extremely slow. So we have to do things that are counterintuitive to us. When the medical officer of health of Ontario, Kieran Moore, says, I imagine, my gut tells me that the masks of students will be off at some point, but later than the rest. That's a gut. That's his gut talking. He's talking to Canadian there, which is the gut. It's not the gut. The strategic approach is we're off to the races. Why? Because our kids are 2 years behind on learning and many of them are not in school. Why must we be off to the races in national unity to unsuch borders? Because the country is falling apart in the centrifugal forces. Why must we be off to the races in the economy? Because if we wait, more businesses will disintegrate. They don't stick around for you to have a coffee and say, I feel comfortable now lifting restrictions. These are what I call Twitter or Facebook positions, but they're not strategic positions for a country like Canada. And therefore, we need to overcome the foolish instinct to believe our Twitter feed and say, this is the structure of our country. This is the structure of the systems in collapse. There are 8 of them. We need to inject maximum energy at the front end in order for all of them to begin to reconsolidate. And only then might we, in more difficult post-pandemic circumstances, reach 2019, because we've collapsed way before 2019. We remove everything today, we're still not at 2019 quality of life. Other countries are, because they didn't collapse to the same extent.
The report you can access at i21cq.com, the Institute for 21st Century Questions. It is the product of the Canada Science and Policy Committee to Exit the Pandemic. The chair of that committee, Irvin Studin, joins me now. Irvin, always a pleasure, sir. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you. I'm co-chair of Kwadwo Karamantang, doctor, and we've brought the scientists and policy people together, and always a pleasure. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.